Today is the 28th of March, 2017. I am Robert Whaley, retired historian from Ohio University, and we're having a discussion with David DeWitt of the Athens News, and this is called Athens Speakout 400. The topic is the fourth short review of Bernie Sanders' book entitled Our Revolution, A Future to Believe In, published in New York in 2016. And we have broken this down, well, let's say Bernie Sanders has broken his memoir down into two parts. And we had 4 shows on the first part, and we're now doing the second part. And it lists 10 chapters in the second part. And we're looking at Chapter 7, The Real Criminal Justice Reform. And hopefully today we can reach Chapter 10, The Corporate Media, The Threat to Our Democracy, and the conclusion, which will be the end of this series of trying to do a memoir of Bernie Sanders' book on his campaign against Hillary Clinton in the primary. So, Chapter 7, The Real Criminal Justice Reform, we had more or less done half of it, and Bernie begins this chapter with the United States today as the criminal system has put more people in jail than any other country on earth. Well, I think that's Bernie's weakest chapter, because he should have discussed the Constitution, because criminal law is exceedingly complex. The duty of the president is to enforce congressional laws as they stand. And if there's a controversy about the Bill of Rights, it is up to the Supreme Court to interpret the Bill of Rights. So in addition to the federal criminal system, it is supplemented by 50 state constitutions and 50 legal codes defining many kinds of crime. So I might skip over a couple of pages here and have my first question to Dave. Over on page 3, I make the statement that sociology is a weak discipline compared to history or law. Do you have any disagreement or debate with that summary?
Sociology is a weak discipline compared to history or law. Well, yeah, I agree, because history and law are much more concrete. History, as much dispute as there can be sometimes about the truth in history, you're dealing with facts,
right? Known
facts to a large degree. And in law, you're dealing with written, criminal, constitutional, civil law,
right,
that can be studied,
right,
and there are concepts that can be studied. Sociology, it's not an invalid field, it's just much more fluid than either of those other two fields, which I see as much more concrete.
Yeah, it's about society, and as my mother used to say, talk is cheap. And campaigners on television can say anything, and the voters are confused because they can't discover the lies, because you can't go back over the record and publish the lies, okay? Mm-hmm. They get erased.
Right.
And then Trump is able to say, well, I didn't say that, I meant this. And that's the characteristic of a demagogue.
Well, yeah, I think authoritarianism in general, or totalitarianism, or demagoguery, is all based on an anti-truth,
right,
an anti-fact sentiment,
right,
because
right,
the leader is the person who is supposed to control what is real or not real, what is truthful and not truthful, factual or
infactual. And under the Constitution,
infactual.
We have 3 kinds of leaders: the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. And
Right.
that's all spelt out in a constitutional document.
The U.S. Constitution was set up specifically against totalitarianism and the usurpation of power by a supreme king or monarch.
Monarch, yeah. Totalitarianism was not a word in 1776.
Right.
The monarchs were.
Yeah, and I would say despotism was, I don't know if that was a word at the time, but it was a concept that was well known to the people of the world under the monarchical systems. So anyway, our system of checks and balances was set up specifically with monarchs in mind.
King George III.
And to prevent monarchy.
George, the revolution was against King George III, and the Declaration spelt out all kinds of legal grievances. You know, the Quebec Act.
Yeah. It sure
Stamp
did.
Act.
Not to mention Jefferson's famous life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
That's the Declaration of Independence.
The pursuit of happiness. Now that leaves it pretty open. We're all still wondering, to some degree, what he meant by that.
Well, I think I know, and most people who study Jefferson know. Jefferson got 99% of that from Locke.
Well, yeah, the life and liberty, but he changed life, liberty, and property
to he changed
pursuit of happiness.
He changed the word property because most people thought of property as real estate and chattels, something very physical.
Right.
But Jefferson was an intellectual. Jefferson was a philosopher. And he said that intellectual property, you know, that's the pursuit of happiness. And what made him happy was studying history and science and biology to find out how to discover the truth. So pursuit of happiness is a little bit open-ended, as you put it. But this goes back to the Greeks. The Greeks had two kinds of happiness. Hedonism, which means wine, women, and song, and enjoy yourself. And then a more sophisticated kind of happiness was Epicureanism. And you got Epicureanism by studying philosophy. That was a highly cultured, highly civilized form of thinking. So Greek democracy and Jewish theology influenced the creation of a new religion called Christianity. And Paul and Jesus borrowed from both the Greeks and the ancient Jews to make a new religion, which went under many modifications after 311, when it was 311 they tolerated, the Roman emperor tolerated, and 325 he wanted a declaration of a creed, and we had the Nicene Creed, which became the foundation of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Episcopalian Church. And then we had Protestant Reformation, we had Scientific Revolution, and that's another problem. So I think we'll skip over religion unless you have something vital to say.
I do not.
Okay, well, let's go to question 2 over on page 4. I make the statement there that in 1848, anthropology was developed beginning in the western United States and Australia, and that anthropologists asked the question, is there such a thing as a pure race? And if there is, how many races are there? 3? Black, white, and yellow? And how do scientists classify the American Indians, the Polynesians, and the Micronesians? So what I'm saying is that the term race is exceedingly abstract, and the ancient Hebrews were divided into 12 tribes, and the Israelites and the Judeans survived down to the times of Jesus and Paul. Do you have any comment or question about that problem of defining race?
I do have a comment about it. I don't believe in race.
Neither do I.
Race is a social construct. There's only one race, the human race.
I agree with that.
And it started immigrating out of Africa about 75,000 years ago, and
All right.
we've gone through various evolutionary changes based on where these
That's
different
biological.
factions
Biological.
of the one human race ended up. But in general, like if I go to the doctor and they ask for my race, I always check other and I write down human, because that's what it is. It's the human race.
You are a 21st man, 21st century.
Yeah.
You see, the problem is that 99% of the Americans think that America is composed of two races at least, black and white, and that caused the Civil War.
Yes. The whole issue, this whole fallacy is trickled down throughout and defined much of American history, I would
And
argue.
we have a large problem in looking at a scientific definition of the big tent called race. And I would prefer looking at some books like Gunnar Myrdal, a Norwegian sociologist, who in 1944 wrote The American Dilemma.
Oh, yeah, right.
And he foresaw that since the United States had gone to war against Nazism and Hitler tried to exterminate the Jews, that Americans had two definitions of race, a Jewish concept of race and a black-white definition of race. So the American dilemma is to look at anthropology and see that tribalism, as you point out, is the real basis of the evolution of anthropology. So it takes a long time to educate the black American and the white American on the two sides of the Mason-Dixon line. And I'm afraid that both Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have not clarified the complexities of race. That's the problem I see. Okay.
Yeah, I think we have a long way to go.
A long way to go, right. And
we-
Bernie admits that. But he's more optimistic than I am.
Well, and I think it goes back to what you just mentioned about tribalism. I think the human being is a tribal animal by nature. I think that's part of it's our primitive nature. It's how human beings survived for many thousands of years.
Right.
And today our technological evolution is so rapidly outpacing our biological evolution, that this creates an inevitable conflict, because we are drawn back into more primitive ideas of tribalism, even as technology makes a lot of those ideas obsolete. We are living in a world today where you can fly across the globe in less than 24 hours. And yet we still define ourselves.
People's ideas do not travel that fast.
Right. And neither does our ability to evolve intellectually beyond our biological capacities, despite the rapid evolution of our technology.
And that's what all
technological
PhD
advances.
Professors learn from their students. It takes a long time. You've got to have a lot of patience to teach students that race is a complex idea. And I have been accused of a racist. And but they had their own definition of race. In any case, skipping up now to a new concept over on page 5.
Well, can I make one final point?
Yeah.
I just want to point out a question that James Baldwin, the journalist and author and writer, he used to always put this question, and I think it's a very interesting question that a lot of people have to consider. Why is that, and why are these definitions of race necessary? What is it in the American...
That's very simple. Historical inheritance.
Yeah, right. And that's
1607, black slaves were brought here to Virginia.
Right.
They were slave traders.
So at this point in American history, what, aside from the tribalism? What makes it so necessary to continue? What is it within us, within people who see distinct races and want to divide humans up in between these races?
It's the problem of us.
What is it within their hearts that makes them need that?
Their hearts.
What makes them need that? Need those differences? And I think that's an interesting question. I don't think there is a definable answer to it.
I think it's very simple. I think it's exceedingly simple. Every child from 5 to 18 is educated by his mother and father, and he's educated in prejudices. There is no such thing as a father and mother who didn't have some kind of prejudice. So the Catholics used to have a prejudice against Protestants and Jews, and the Jews had prejudice against Protestants and Catholics. The three
and the child carries on those prejudices.
Well,
I understand that.
He learned that in school.
What is it in human nature that demands prejudice exists in the first place? Why do we seek to put ourselves above others?
A child 18,
as humans.
As a child 18 has reason and is very underdeveloped, and he also has emotions. Some people are moved by emotions and never learn to reason. Now, I had 4 years of mathematics in high school and learned that in order to pass mathematics, you have to have logic, geometry, algebra, advanced algebra, and so forth and so on. And then when I went to college, I studied history first, which is plenty of facts. But the historian is very cautious in his conclusion. Who, when, where, how, that's very simple. But the why, now that's a big debate. You know, why did the Civil War break out? Why did the Protestant Reformation break out? That gets into the controversy. And then the people with their prejudices from all sides use violence to solve what should be a political problem or a legal problem. So law and politics is an attempt to civilize primitive, barbaric, emotional behavior.
Right, going back to Hegel. Yeah, otherwise, life is nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's Hobbes, actually.
Hobbes. Okay.
Yeah, that's Hobbes. Okay, so I think I haven't got anything more to say about race at this point.
No, we can move on.
Except that the United States, like all countries, have a race problem. And I think that Sweden and Switzerland have developed more sophisticated forms of democracy and see that racial prejudices is one of the weaknesses in American society that could end democracy. And Hitler did that in Germany. He ended democracy by appealing to primitive racial prejudices.
Absolutely, and talk about
so we have to avoid
talk about despots and demagogues being anti-fact.
Right.
There wasn't under Hitler. There wasn't science. There was German science and there was Jewish science.
That's right.
And so he's creating divisions.
Yeah,
and
right.
he's
okay.
Yeah.
Well, we all think Hitler's a bad man. There is some debate about Marx, however. Now, Marx was a philosopher who I admire, and he gave rise to Lenin. And Lenin was a journalist who simplified Marx, and then Lenin passed the idea of socialism and communism to Stalin, and he became a totalitarian dictator, so that communism degenerated from Marx to Lenin to Stalin, until finally the Soviet Union collapsed.
Right. And
so that's where we are now.
Some even make the argument that true communism as envisioned by Marx has never really been tried.
Yeah, he had a definition of utopian communism.
Right. And he's one of the most misunderstood misrepresented philosophers, I guess, social philosophers of the last 200 years, I would argue. I think his ideas are
distorted.
Very much distorted today.
And Karl Marx in his own lifetime said to his followers, I am not a Marxist.
Yeah.
I am a dialectical materialist. Mm-hmm. Well, along comes Bernie, not Bernie, a philosopher born in Russia, fled to England by the name of Sir Isaiah Berlin. Mm-hmm. And I read Sir Isaiah Berlin's biography of Marx. And he claimed that Marx confused his readers by talking about materialism and determination. Mm-hmm. And if you read between the lines, according to this interpretation, Marx was really a hidden humanist. And he inherited humanism from his Jewish rabbi grandfather. Mm-hmm. And his father became a convert to Lutheranism because he wanted a job in Prussia. So he was only a lukewarm Protestant, but he still had the Jewish concept of humanism in the back of him. So then,
I think that makes a lot of sense to me because his approach was very materialistic. But if you look behind that, where's the material? He was analyzing the material world and what leads to what results for what people.
That's right.
And there's certainly a humanism behind it because it's almost utilitarianistic in maximizing the good, the material good for the most amount of people.
Right. Yeah. Well, anyway, Marx had his flaws and he had his strengths. So I think I don't want to say anything more about Marx at this point, but to change the subject of this chapter 7, I think that Bernie raises a new problem on the war on drugs, which was a propaganda campaign started twice, one time by Richard Nixon and the second time by Ronald Reagan. And the war on drugs is a metaphor, like the Cold War, the war on high prices, the war against the mafia, the war against poverty. Few bullets were ever fired in the so-called war called the Cold War. Missing from Bernie's future agenda is some kind of scholarly books that we need in order to control the real problem of drug addiction.
Well, I think it's almost disturbing because that type of propaganda, that type of rhetoric, the war on, is so appealing to the American culture and sensibility. And I understand that that's a fact. I don't understand necessarily why that's the case. That this militaristic type of thinking, especially on domestic issues, should be so appealing to the populace at large.
Well, that was cultivated by Hollywood.
And it's a 20th century thing, is it not?
Hollywood was the 19th century. You know, the shootout of the OK Corral, Billy the Kid.
The Old West,
The Old West. The fastest gun in the West.
Right, yeah.
Well, that became a Hollywood myth.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the Hollywood gun battle between the good guys and the bad guys, between the cowboys and the Indians, between the sheep herders and the cow herders, that became an American saga, American novels, okay?
Right.
It began with Zane Grey, and the Virginian. And Hollywood made millions on that because it was popular. It appeals to the emotions.
Yeah.
Not reasonable. What's unreasonable is to sit around and look at television and say, we need another fast gun. We got to have the Second Amendment. I got to have a pistol in my house in order to defend myself.
Well, and you see it everywhere.
Crazy.
You see it everywhere.
But not in Europe. No, not in Europe.
Well, no, I mean America. I was trying to buy a birthday gift for my friend's 7-year-old son, and I went to the boys section of the toy aisle, and it's all tanks and guns
That's right.
and police,
That's
and it's all very aggressive, you know?
That's right.
And the only thing I could find that wasn't, I mean, either you do something boring like a puzzle, or you get, you know, a superhero action figure. But even the superhero action figures, those superhero movies are full, and I'm a big fan of them, but they're still full of confrontation and violence.
That's right.
And so everything in those aisles spoke to violence in one form or another, whether it's an Old West gun or a newer Nerf gun or a military tank or whatever
and there
it
are
is.
some sophisticated Christians, particularly the Quakers and the Unitarians and the Congregationalists, who refuse to buy guns for their kids.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my mother tried to discourage it. When I was 6 years old, all my friends were playing with cap pistols.
Mm-hmm.
And she wouldn't let me have a cap pistol. So 2 years later, when the other kids were graduating to BB guns, my mother gave in and said, okay, you can have a cap
pistol. Yeah.
But I never got into these games using a cap pistol.
Mm-hmm.
The most I ever used was a water pistol.
Right.
I was taught by my mother to be somewhat pacifist. Mm-hmm. Because she believed in the dictum of Paul. Jesus says to Paul, put your sword back in the sheath. He who lives by the sword will die by the sword.
Dies by the sword, right.
And my mother took that seriously. And she tried to shelter me from violence. But then when I got into fourth grade, my mother discouraged me from going to movies. My playmates used to go to the movies all alone, see. My mother discouraged that, and I was forbidden to go. Finally, in the fourth grade, my best friend, his name was Richard Carlson, so we're going to go to the 10-cent movie at a Saturday. I said, well, my mother won't let me go. I'm going to talk to your mother, and I'm going to persuade her. He came to my house, and he persuaded my mother, okay, you can go. So I used to go with Carlson then in the fourth grade. But I was always a late bloomer, is what I'm saying, into the world of violence.
Yeah.
And that came from both my mother and father, because my father was a veteran of World War I. And he came out as a kind of a pacifist, only he called it an isolationism.
Well, and first we've got to take a station break.
Boy, that
but
went fast.
I would like to get into isolationism and the role of that.
Okay, go ahead.
After our station break. So,
this is Robert Whaley. I'm a historian, and we're trying to influence current TV history by bringing in all the values. And Bernie Sanders, I think, did a better job than Hillary Clinton in bringing back Jewish values to the debate. Now, you would like to say something about this?
Well, you say it starts with Hollywood and the Old West and stuff in the late 19th century. But in World War I and even into World War II, before Americans got involved, there was a strong isolationist streak amongst the American population.
That's right.
And that seems to have gone very much away in the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st.
Well, the veterans who came back from the war, most of them did not become pacifists, but they became isolationists. And they blamed Woodrow Wilson for dragging America into an unnecessary war. And the isolationists said, well, Woodrow Wilson was the problem. Because he was brought into the war by propaganda, British propaganda. That was the thesis. The British propaganda fooled Wilson into coming into the war. Okay. So Woodrow Wilson had a foreign policy which was a little bit confused. Okay. He inherited 2 or 3 different traditions. And he was elected in 1912 as a progressive, but he was also elected from Virginia. He was the first Virginian Southerner elected to the presidency since the Civil War. And he then went to Princeton, got a PhD in history and a PhD in political science, and became the president of Princeton. And then from the president of Princeton, he ran for the governor of New Jersey as a progressive. So he was elected when the Republicans were fighting between the Teddy Roosevelt progressives and the old-fashioned big businessmen corporate Republicans, the conservative Republicans. So the Republican Party was split in the time of 1912 when Teddy Roosevelt decided he wanted to run a third term under the Progressive Party. Well, he split the Republican Party between the progressives and the Taft conservatives. And as a result, Woodrow Wilson snuck in.
Right.
And then Wilson came in as a progressive, but his progressivism was limited to organized labor. He helped the unions organize, and he believed in satisfying the Irish and the Italians and the American immigrants. And he, by the way, was the first president to appoint a Jew to the Supreme Court, namely Louis D. Brandeis. So in some ways, Wilson was very progressive, but he still had that old Southern tradition. And he would not invite a black man to the White House and said, no, I still believe in segregation. So when the United States went to war in 1917, they had a segregated army. And the officers were all white, and the blacks were put in the transport corps, hauling garbage and ammunition to the front. They just didn't trust blacks. They just thought they were dumb, you know. So then we come out with a redevelopment of the Ku Klux Klan that came back in Indiana.
And we had
a rebirth of racism as well as isolation. So isolation and racism and anti-imperialism got a little bit tangled up in people's mind. Well, you see, what happened to Woodrow Wilson was the Second World War broke out in the 30s, and the former pacifists, the former isolationists, gradually gave it up. So that Franklin Roosevelt, in 1932, when he was elected, was still believing in isolationism, because he said, well, there's no war on the horizon yet. But Roosevelt began to be influenced by the events in Europe and could see that Japan was expanding.
Yeah.
And he could see that Mussolini's fascism was expanding. And he had been the Assistant Secretary of Navy under Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, and he had actually, and he idolized Uncle Teddy.
Teddy Roosevelt, and
and also Woodrow Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, and he then saw that America has to get into world affairs.
Yeah, and I think even in the First World War, he played a big role in building up the Navy as Assistant Secretary of Navy.
Right.
Because I think he saw the entrance of the United States into World War I as inevitable. And I think by the 30s, Franklin Roosevelt also saw,
Second World War
was inevitable as well.
That's right.
And I think that he tried to prepare both the nation in a PR standpoint, but also in a military standpoint.
Right.
He began to prepare for what he knew was coming down the pike.
So if you look at the public opinion polls, isolationism reaches its high point in 1931, and then at 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, it gradually declines, and interventionism gradually grows. And in 1941, there was a very decisive vote in Congress, and the vote was, do you vote in favor of rearmament? Do you want to draft in a peacetime army? Because France has already collapsed. It looks like Britain is on its last leg. Well, the vote was something like 232 to 233. Roosevelt won the draft by one vote.
Wow. I didn't realize it was that
so
close.
The draft was put into being in 1940 to prepare the United States for Pearl Harbor. So we had the draft in Pearl Harbor. But it didn't.
So it was already in place by the time Pearl Harbor.
The machinery was in place.
Right.
But it really grew after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. People were anxious to go, and this is racist.
Yeah, they didn't need to be
go slap the dirty little chap.
Right.
It's more anti-Japanese feeling than German feeling.
Right.
because they were German Americans. They were a little bit cautious
Right.
about denouncing Hitler. But denouncing Japan, easy. Shintoism religion, barbaric.
Right.
So there you have the crisscrossing of foreign policy, racism, imperialism, and American public opinion is still confused to this day. And it's our job to educate them.
Ideally.
Okay, do you have anything more to comment about the rise and fall of isolationism?
No, I think we can move on from there.
Okay, good. Okay, so anyway, I was going to talk about this war on drugs of Ronald Reagan, and that was a metaphor. And what I'm saying is missing from Bernie's future agenda are some scholarly books on the need to control drug addiction. So coming over here to the next question. I have cited this book many times, and you have at least glanced at it. John C. Burnham, Bad Habits, 6 of them: drinking, smoking, taking drugs, gambling, sexual misbehavior, and swearing in American history. Published by NYU Press in 1993. So I would recommend, now Bernie doesn't give any indication that he ever saw this, and I would recommend that he read that book and get its lessons, because he's a little bit superficial on what to do about drugs, in my opinion. So to review again, Burnham is a professor of social and intellectual history, and he taught at Ohio State University in the history department, and he's still doing research as an adjunct lecturer at Ohio State University's medical school. Now, Burnham is basically a historian of science, but underneath science, he has a philosophy derived from Protestant Puritan values. This book is historically objective in his account of 6 bad habits, and some of them have some harmful medical effects and criminal effects and social consequences. But as a social historian, 6 Bad Habits might have been entitled 6 Venial Sins had the book been published before 1960. This shows you the significance of the decline of religion. Now, Burnham was born in 1929, and as an OSU professor, he regards the 18th Amendment, which established national prohibition on the sale of alcoholic beverages throughout the 48 states, was not a medical failure. Statistically, the Prohibition era on a statewide basis lasted from 1840 to 1917, and only in 1917 was national prohibition put on the books because of World War I, and it lasted from 1917 to 33. But national prohibition did in fact cut down the rate of alcoholic consumption and the rate of the disease of alcoholism. So the repeal of prohibition in 1933, led by Hollywood and the beverage industry to make expanded profits through advertising, theater, literature, and film, was the anti-prohibitionist attitudes, which kind of re-escalated the drug alcohol problems in our own times. Because organized crime, mafia, did have a speakeasy era, and that was one of the problems of Bernie's book that I think should be in, John Burnham's book, that should be enlightening. So do you have any more comments about that book and its importance for the future?
No, I think that you got round to the point that I would have made about prohibition is that, while it may have been successful, as you say, in decreasing the disease of alcoholism, I think that it did also increase criminality, which you pointed out with the rise of the mafia and, you know, what the criminal element was able to do,
Right.
as far as bootlegging and taking advantage
Right.
of the new market.
Yeah, that's true. So skipping over now to another question. The new left movement of college students led to the breakdown in 1968 of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And the new left reinforced a serious debate among Democratic senators and governors. Inside the big tent, the two factions of Democrats called themselves the Doves and the Hawks. And President Lyndon Johnson, who had expanded American intervention in the Indo-Chinese civil wars in 1964, came to the conclusion they had to resign in February of 1968.
Well, not seek re-election,
Yeah,
not resign.
all right, not run again.
Right. Yes.
He resigned from running again.
Right.
And he said, vote for Hubert Humphrey.
Yeah.
Yeah, he didn't officially resign, but he would resign from campaigning.
Yeah. I only make that distinction because I think it's notable that Nixon is the only president who was forced to resign.
Because he was impeached.
Right.
And he wanted to avoid conviction.
Yes.
Yeah, that's...
So,
that's
anyway, I don't mean to interrupt. I
No,
just
that's
wanted-
good. That's
yeah.
legalistic. That's
Yeah.
legalistic thinking. But in an informal way.
Lyndon Johnson knew that it would have been impossible for him to
Yeah.
win re-election, so he didn't. Right.
Now, okay, so I think I've said enough about that, except, yeah, I think we've finished there. Let's go on to another question here. Let's skip over to, I was going to skip page 8, get down to page 9. Do you want to make any comments on page 9, which begins with these comments? The so-called sexual revolution began slowly in the 1950s and the 1960s with Alfred Kinsey's reports on the sexual behavior of the human male in 1948 and the sexual behavior of the human female in 1953. Later biologists and sociologists and psychologists and pollsters and intellectual historians have shown that Kinsey's statistics were not scientifically collected. His Institute of Biology at the University of Indiana exaggerated the prevalence of sexual misbehavior, especially the incident of homosexuality.
I quibble with you,
You quibble-
characterizing homosexuality as misbehavior.
According to whose standard?
Well, you're going to argue from the point of the Judeo-Christian standard.
That's my behavior.
I'm going to argue from the point of the natural standard that homosexuality is found in 1,500 species throughout the world. Humans are no different than any other animal.
I would like to see those statistics.
Well, I can produce them for you,
In what book?
Well, do you want me to look it up right now? I can
give
do
me-
it now,
give me one
or
book.
we can do it next time.
All right, give me
But
one
there
book.
are multiple natural biological studies that show that over 1,000 different species on planet Earth have incidences of homosexuality.
Incidences?
It's a perfectly natural thing. It is not misbehavior.
Wait a minute.
Now you can go on and continue your analysis of Kinsey. I also quibble with your assertion that Kinsey was not scientific. I think that his studies were conducted with scientific
We're
veracity.
going to have to have another program on this controversial stuff. You've interjected a lot of assertions that need to be documented. That's all I'm saying.
All right.
I don't think you had a biology course, have you?
Yes, of course I took biology.
Biology what? 101?
It was introductory biology,
Introductory biology. Okay. Well, I think that if you study biology, there is microbiology, there is physiology, there is genetics, and biology is a very detailed, sophisticated discipline. And I think we agree on the basic principles of evolution. That's not a question. But how you interpret the incidence of homosexuality is a statistical problem of major proportions. Okay, so that we'll have to discuss. But anyway, in my opinion, Kinsey's biology has been refuted by other biologists, psychologists, and
I
sociologists.
disagree. I believe it's been asserted
I
and
get
shown
the
and proven
documents. You can
true
disagree.
over and over
We don't wanna
again
keep-
by a variety of other ones. And
Fine.
if you want an example right now as far as homosexuality being documented in over 1,500 species, the 2006 study by the University of Oslo against nature, has proven that it's been observed in over 1,500 species.
All right.
And I'm happy to continue to find more
Okay,
documentation to bolster.
You have one book.
Oh, I have more than one book.
All right, you have 10 books.
All right, I have 10 books.
Fine.
And I have 10 books that I agree with. You're welcome to disagree with them.
Go ahead.
Same-sex behavior seen in nearly all animals. Review finds from Science Daily. Same-sex behavior seen in nearly all animals from physiology.org. Bruce Baghemi's book, 1999, Biological Exuberance, Animal Homosexuality and Natural Diversity. Max Harold's 1999 book, Biological Exuberance. Against Nature, I already mentioned the University of Oslo. Calvin Reed, 1999, A New Look at Homosexuality in Nature. Animal Homosexuality, A Biosocial Perspective by Aldo Pioni from Cambridge University. I can go on and on. I've got 20, 30, 40, 50,
Right.
oh boy. I've got over 100 sources right here.
Good.
Okay.
Now, the next show, do you want to look at one source or all 100?
I don't think that we're going to get through all 100.
All right, well,
Anyway, you called it misbehavior. I totally disagree with that characterization.
okay, that's your opinion. You're welcome to your opinion. But your opinion does not make it a fact.
Not any more than yours.
I can tell you that what Kinsey wrote, and I can cite Kinsey's statistics. And I can
I'm
find
familiar with Kinsey's work very much as well.
Okay. And how and why were his statistics flawed?
Well, that's your assertion. That's not my assertion.
Okay. Well, we have to get a little bibliography on both sides of the question. If the Germans and the French go to war, you've got to look at French sources and you've got to look at German sources.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All I'm saying is your sources are selective and my sources are selective too. And John Burnham's sources are selective. Okay? So that's what I think we'll have to end that subject at this point.
Okay.
I don't think I have anything more to say in the amount of time we have.
Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes left or so.
Okay. So let's go on to another theme about drug addiction. Bernie's essay rightfully condemns drug addiction of opioids and cocaine as real health problems, but he tends to downplay the enforcement of law. Bernie is soft on the consumption of marijuana, because he assumes that marijuana is not very harmful compared to cocaine and opioids. Now, John Burnham is a hardline former Puritan who does not want to legalize the mild, addictive, and hallucinogen marijuana. Bernie assumes that a student in the New Left era, he was a student at that era, in 1968, that the police are too hard about enforcing drug laws against poor blacks. And he cites that African Americans and Latinos together comprise 57% of all prisoners in 2014, even though neither of these two groups make up even 1/4 of the U.S. population. Well, those statistics are a little bit loose. It seems to me that from the point of view of a conservative Republican, that these statistics seem to be cherry-picked and are overly sympathetic to blacks convicted of a serious crimes by the local police. The conservative police would have their own selected statistics showing how blacks convicted of taking drugs were convicted previously by a long trail of previous criminal convictions. So Burnham and this historian, Robert Whaley, would argue that in the long run prevention of drug addiction in both black and white communities should be the major goal from a purely physiological point of view.
Can I share my position?
Yeah, go ahead.
I agree that combating drug addiction should be the major goal.
Good.
Absolutely. I do not believe that incarceration is the way to combat addiction. I think that addiction should be treated as the disease that it is,
right,
and it should be treated with addiction treatment. It should be treated with counseling. It should be treated with interventions. It should be treated as a medical issue, not necessarily as an incarceration issue.
That's fine. But who appropriates the money for these psychiatrists?
Well, here's my favorite statistic. I'm glad that you bring that up.
Okay.
For every $1 spent on addiction treatment, we save $7 in law enforcement and prosecutorial costs.
Now say that again.
For every $1 spent on addiction treatment, helping places like Health Recovery Services on Columbus Road in Athens treat people who are addicted, for every $1 we spend there, we save $7 that we would otherwise spend on the criminal justice system, either in law enforcement or prosecutorial costs.
Okay.
So funding addiction treatment at the levels that it should be creates the savings in and of itself. Okay. And if you talk to Chief Tom Pyle from the Athens Police Department or Prosecutor Keller Blackburn from the prosecutor's office, they will tell you, they've told me many times, and I've written about it in the paper, that they can only combat the supply side. They can only go after the dealers. What also needs funded and combated is the demand side, and that's the addicts themselves. And the only way to do that is through successful, well-funded addiction treatment.
Now, wait a minute. The drugs come in from Mexico. There have to be some kind of a police to stop the smuggling.
I'm not saying that we should defund
okay.
the supply side. The law enforcement needs its funding too, but we need to bring the demand side. We need to bring the addiction treatment side up, and in the long run, that's going to save money. In our system.
So you have X dollars to spend, and the debate is, do we put? Let's say we have $10 to spend. Do we put $10 in jail and $10 for drug treatment, or is it 7 to 1?
I think it should be 50-50.
Oh, you think it should be 50-50? Well, I don't have any quarrel with that.
So $5 each. But right now it's more like $9 on enforcement and $1 on addiction
2
treatment.
weeks, we have to stop here. And we haven't gotten through this controversial chapter. And we'll have to continue that some weeks down the road. And as I was saying, This is the debate between, there's debates about drugs, there's debates about sex, and there's debates about war, and they're all kind of intertwined, and that's why debate is necessary on all fronts. And I called this show, Debate is the Oxygen of Democracy, and we have a lot of debates about sexuality still ahead of us. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, good.